It was just a few days before Christmas, and my entire family had gathered at my childhood home to celebrate the holiday season. The tree was up, the lights twinkling in the corner of the living room, and the smell of gingerbread cookies filled the house. It was supposed to be a joyous occasion, a time to reconnect, but for some reason, I felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Perhaps it was the cold, strange silence between my parents, who rarely seemed to be on the same page these days, or maybe it was the strange, lingering feeling of being watched. Even as I sat with my cousins, playing games and joking around, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was lurking in the shadows, watching my every move. The others laughed at my discomfort, thinking it was just stress from work, but I knew it was more than that. I was starting to feel paranoid, as if the house itself was pressing in on me. That night, after the chaos of dinner had settled and everyone was tucked into bed, I found myself restless. The house had grown eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards and the low hum of the wind outside. I wandered through the darkened hallway, trying to shake the unsettling feeling that had gripped me all evening. The house was large, far too large for just the few of us, and I felt its size closing in on me as I moved through its corridors. As I passed the living room, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The fireplace was glowing, but not with the soft warmth of a dying fire. No, there was something different about it, something wrong. The embers flickered with a strange, unnatural light, casting long shadows across the room. I took a step forward, my feet cold on the hardwood floor, my heart racing in my chest as I stared at the flickering light. It seemed to be calling me. Against my better judgment, I stepped closer, peering into the hearth. For a moment, there was nothing, just the embers burning low. But then, a figure emerged from the shadows. A tall, dark figure. I froze, unable to move, unable to even breathe as I stared at it. The figure stepped forward slowly, dragging its heavy boots along the floor with a sickening scrape. It wore a long red coat, but the fabric was stained, torn, frayed. The boots were covered in grime, as if the figure had been walking through the dirt and snow for days. But it was the face that made my blood freeze in my veins. The man, or whatever it was, had a face that was impossible to describe. It was a twisted mockery of the jolly old man I had grown up hearing about, the Santa Claus of Christmas folklore. His skin was pale, sickly white, stretched tight over the sharp angles of his skull. His beard was long, but it wasn't white like I'd always imagined. It was a dark, matted mess, streaked with red, and hanging limp around his chin. But it was his eyes, those black, hollow eyes, that truly terrified me. They were empty, devoid of any warmth, any life, just two dark pits of nothingness staring into my soul. "Ho, ho, ho!" the figure rasped, the sound sending a chill down my spine. His voice was hoarse, rough, as though he hadn't spoken in years. "I've come for you, child." I didn't move, couldn't. I felt my body frozen in place, as if some invisible force held me there. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. I couldn't scream, couldn't even whisper for help. The figure took another step toward me, its eyes never leaving mine. As it drew closer, I could smell it, an overwhelming stench of decay, of something long dead. My stomach churned, and I fought the urge to vomit, but the figure wasn't done yet. "You've been a very naughty child, haven't you?" it whispered, its voice like sandpaper scraping against my ears. It seemed to be reading my mind, speaking the words I had never spoken aloud. "All the secrets you've kept, all the things you've hidden from your family. I know them all." The room seemed to darken, the shadows creeping closer as the figure continued its approach. I could feel its presence wrapping around me, suffocating me, as though the very air was being sucked from the room. My hands trembled as I tried to back away, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if I was paralyzed, trapped in a nightmare I couldn't escape. "You thought you could hide from me?" it said, its voice now a low growl. "But I know everything." The figure reached out a long, bony hand, its fingers like claws, and I could feel the coldness of its touch as it brushed against my cheek. I wanted to scream, wanted to run, but the words were trapped in my throat, and my body refused to obey. "I see the guilt in your eyes," the figure whispered, its voice now a venomous hiss. "I see the things you've done, the lies you've told, the darkness you've tried to bury. You can't escape from me. You can't hide." As the figure's hand lingered on my face, I could feel it, its touch, like ice, sinking into my skin, freezing me from the inside out. My body grew colder, my thoughts slower, as if the very essence of me was being drained. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the figure stepped back, grinning like something far worse than any monster, far worse than anything I could comprehend. "Merry Christmas," it whispered, before disappearing into the shadows. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes again, the living room was empty. The fire was gone, and the house was silent. I was alone, but I wasn't the same. I felt different. The weight of the figure's words still echoed in my mind, like a sinister refrain. "I know everything." I stumbled back to my room, my legs weak, my body trembling with a fear I couldn't explain. The house was still and quiet, but the silence was deafening. I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep, wondering if the nightmare was truly over, or if it was only just beginning. And as I lay there, unable to close my eyes, I heard it again. A soft scrape on the floor, a creak from the hallway, the unmistakable sound of heavy boots dragging along the wood. I knew then that it wasn't over. The Santa who knew my secrets was still out there, waiting, watching, and he would come again when I least expected it. It was a bitterly cold December night, the kind where the air stings your skin and the silence of freshly fallen snow feels almost deafening. I had been working late, burning the midnight oil to finish a presentation that was due the following morning. And by the time I stepped out of the office, the streets were empty save for the soft glow of Christmas lights. The festive cheer seemed almost ironic as I trudged home, my breath visible in the frosty air. The snow crunched beneath my boots, and as I turned the corner to my neighborhood, I noticed something odd. A figure, large and hunched, standing beneath the flickering glow of a street lamp. At first, I dismissed it as a neighbor setting up decorations or some late-night wanderer enjoying the stillness. But as I drew closer, the figure didn't move, and the faint outlines of its shape became clearer. It was dressed as Santa Claus, but not the kind you'd expect to see at a mall or in a parade. His suit was tattered and stained, the white trim yellowed with age or worse. The beard was patchy, and his face, obscured by shadows, seemed elongated, almost grotesque. His presence sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the winter air. As I passed him, he turned his head sharply, too sharply, as if his neck had no bones. I froze in place, my heart racing, and for a long moment, he simply stared at me. His eyes, oh God, his eyes, were unlike anything I'd ever seen. Black as the void, yet glimmering with something malevolent. They seemed to pull me into them. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. He smiled then, a slow, deliberate grin that revealed teeth far too sharp for a human mouth. And in a voice that was both deep and raspy, he said, "Naughty or nice?" The words crawled down my spine like icy fingers. Without thinking, I bolted, the fear overriding every rational thought. I ran and ran until I reached the safety of my apartment, slamming the door behind me and locking every bolt. My lungs burned, and I could barely catch my breath, but the sense of relief was fleeting. I glanced out the window, and there he was, standing across the street, still as a statue, staring up at my window. That was when I noticed the bag slung over his shoulder, not full of toys, but something that writhed and moved. My stomach turned as I realized they were bodies, small ones, children. I backed away from the window, my mind racing for an explanation, but none came. All night, I heard the sound of heavy boots pacing back and forth outside my building, accompanied by a low, guttural chuckle that seemed to echo inside my head. Sleep was impossible. The next morning, when the sun rose, he was gone, leaving only a deep crimson stain in the snow where he had stood. I told myself it was a nightmare, some figment of my overworked imagination, but the events that followed proved otherwise. Everywhere I went, I saw him, at the grocery store, standing at the end of an aisle, in the parking lot, watching me from a distance. Even outside my office building, his silhouette illuminated by the headlights of passing cars. And each time, the question came, whispered or growled or hissed, naughty or nice? My coworkers began to notice my paranoia, but how could I explain it? How could I tell them that I was being stalked by something that defied explanation? The worst came on Christmas Eve. I had barricaded myself in my apartment, every window and door locked tight, refusing to leave or even look outside. The clock struck midnight, and for a moment, there was silence. A silence so profound it felt suffocating. Then, the laughter started, low and distant at first but growing louder, closer, until it was right outside my door. Naughty or nice? The voice was louder now, more insistent. The doorknob rattled, and I could see the shadow of his boots beneath the crack. I held my breath, clutching a kitchen knife, my only weapon, as the door began to creak open. But just as quickly as it had started, it stopped. The laughter faded, and when I finally dared to look, the hallway was empty, save for a single gift box wrapped in black paper with a blood-red bow. Trembling, I opened it, and inside was a photograph of me, taken that very moment, staring in horror at the open door. I don't know how he took it, how he left it, or how he disappeared without a trace, but I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. I'm writing this now as a warning. If you see him, don't engage. Don't look into his eyes. And for the love of God, don't answer his question. Naughty or nice, it doesn't matter. He's coming for you either way. It all began on Christmas Eve, the night I had eagerly awaited since the beginning of December. I was a child then, no older than 12, and every year, I would anxiously wait for the jolly man in the red suit to arrive, carrying presents for all the good boys and girls. But this year felt different. Something about the night hung in the air, thick and unnerving, like a storm was brewing on the horizon. I tried to ignore the eerie feeling, thinking maybe it was just the cold that seeped through the old walls of our house. But deep down, I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. As the night wore on, the house grew colder, the wind outside howling through the trees like a warning. My parents had gone to bed early, leaving me alone in the living room with the tree, the lights twinkling softly, casting long shadows on the walls. The house was unnaturally quiet, save for the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards. I sat by the fire, watching the flames dance, trying to force myself into the holiday spirit. But the air was thick with tension, and my mind kept wandering back to the strange feeling that something was watching me. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that it was just the excitement of the night playing tricks on my young mind. But then I heard it, soft at first, like a faint scrape, almost like the sound of nails against wood. It came from the direction of the chimney. My heart skipped a beat. I had heard tales of Santa Claus sliding down the chimney, but this sound, this scraping, was different. It wasn't the sound of someone gently sliding down. No, it was something far more sinister. I got up slowly, my feet barely making a sound on the hardwood floor as I approached the fireplace. I stared up at the chimney, the dark opening staring back at me like a gaping mouth. The scraping continued, now louder, more frantic, as if something was trying to climb up or down, but couldn't quite make it. My breath caught in my throat, and I instinctively backed away, my feet stumbling over the rug as I tried to distance myself from whatever was making that sound. But the noise grew louder, more erratic, and before I could react, the fireplace began to shake, the bricks rattling with an unnatural force. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps as I watched in horror. Then, with a sudden, deafening crash, something shot out of the chimney and landed in the living room with a sickening thud. I froze. My mind raced, unable to comprehend what I had just witnessed. The creature that emerged from the fireplace was not Santa Claus. It was something else, something darker, more terrifying than anything I had ever seen. It was tall, towering over me, its body covered in matted, black fur. Its face was a grotesque mockery of a human's, twisted and malformed, with pale, bloodshot eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. Its mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin, sharp, yellowed teeth glistening in the dim light. And on its back, it carried a large, burlap sack, bulging with something inside. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it, my body frozen in place as it slowly turned its head to look at me, its eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my stomach churn. It smiled, showing rows of jagged teeth, and in a voice that sounded like the growl of some long-dead creature, it spoke. "I've been waiting for you." I couldn't move, couldn't scream, my body paralyzed with fear as the creature stepped closer, its heavy footsteps thundering through the room. I tried to run, tried to escape, but my legs refused to cooperate. My feet glued to the floor as the creature loomed over me. It reached into its sack and pulled out a long, twisted length of rope, its eyes never leaving mine as it advanced. "You've been very naughty," it hissed, its voice low and menacing. "And naughty children don't get presents. They get punishment." I could feel the cold sweat trickling down my back, my mind racing with panic as I realized I had no way out. The creature reached out and grabbed me with one of its long, clawed hands, its fingers wrapping around my wrist like a vice. I screamed, or at least I tried to, but no sound came out, my throat constricted with terror. The creature's grip tightened, and I could feel the bone in my arm threatening to snap under its strength. "You think you're safe," it growled, "but there is no escape. You belong to me now." I was dragged toward the fireplace, my feet scraping against the floor as the creature pulled me closer to the edge of the hearth. I kicked and struggled, but it was no use. Its grip was too strong and I was too weak to break free. The creature tossed me into the fire, its laughter echoing in the room as I tumbled toward the flames. But before I could hit the burning embers, I was yanked back, my body crashing into the floor with a painful thud. I looked up to see the creature standing above me, its eyes burning with an unnatural hunger. "Not yet," it whispered. "Not yet." The creature turned away, and I could hear it rummaging through its sack. When it turned back to me, it was holding something that made my blood run cold. It was a small, grotesque doll, its porcelain face cracked and stained with what looked like dried blood. The doll's eyes were hollow, and its mouth was stretched into a wide, eerie grin. "Do you like my gift?" the creature asked, its voice dripping with malice. "I've been making them for a long time." I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I stared at the doll, the terror creeping up my spine. What did it want with me? What was this thing, this monster masquerading as Santa Claus? The creature leaned down, its face inches from mine, its foul breath warm against my skin. "You're going to be my next gift," it whispered. "You'll be mine forever." And then, with a flick of its wrist, it tossed the doll at me, its glass eyes seeming to follow me as it landed on the floor beside me with a sickening clatter. The creature grinned once more, revealing its sharp teeth as it towered over me. "Merry Christmas," it said, its voice dripping with venom. And with that, it vanished into the shadows, leaving me alone in the cold, dark room. I could still feel its presence, lingering in the air, like a heavy, suffocating fog. I scrambled to my feet, my body trembling with fear, but when I looked around, the house was silent again. The fireplace was cold, the flames gone, and the tree sat untouched, its lights flickering dimly. The only evidence of the creature's visit was the doll lying on the floor, its glass eyes staring at me, unblinking. I didn't sleep that night, couldn't, and as I lay in bed, wide awake, I kept hearing the scrape, the sound of claws against wood, echoing in the distance. I knew it was coming back. It always came back, and next time it wouldn't leave so easily. It was Christmas Eve, and I should have felt joy, but instead, there was a strange, gnawing unease deep in my gut that I couldn't shake. My family had always made a big deal of the holiday, decorating the house in every inch of Christmas cheer possible. But this year was different. I was home alone. My parents were out of town for the night, visiting my aunt in the city, and I had opted to stay behind, claiming I needed a break from the chaos. It was supposed to be a quiet night of movies and snacks, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The house was too still, and every time I glanced toward the window, the shadows outside seemed to move, like something was lurking just beyond my view. At first, I thought it was the wind, a trick of the light, but deep down, I felt something more sinister. It started at 11:45 p.m. I had just finished watching a Christmas special and was beginning to doze off when I heard the sound. Scraping metal, faint but growing louder. It was coming from the chimney. I sat upright, my heart hammering in my chest. It wasn't possible. I told myself it was just the house settling, a draft, but the sound continued. It wasn't the sound of a wind-blown branch or the creak of old wood. No, it was something far more deliberate, something heavier. I felt my pulse quicken as I slowly stood up and moved to the living room. I stared at the fireplace. The faint scraping had now turned into a guttural thud, like someone or something was trying to climb down. I could feel my breath catch in my throat, but I couldn't look away. I heard a faint, slow creak from above, and then, to my horror, the shadow of something large, something unnatural, began to stretch across the ceiling. The weight of it seemed to press down on me as the scraping continued, a rhythmic pattern now, as if whatever was coming down was deliberate, inching its way closer. I backed away, trembling, reaching for the nearest thing to defend myself. A fireplace poker. I had no idea why. I wasn't even sure what I expected to find, but I couldn't just stand there. The shadow grew larger and larger, until finally, a massive, gloved hand reached down from the chimney, followed by a leg, then another. I stumbled backward in shock, unable to move, unable to breathe. The figure was enormous, its black boots scraping against the stone of the fireplace, and as it pulled itself into the room, I saw it clearly for the first time. It was Santa, at least that's what it seemed like at first. His face was obscured by a thick, ragged beard, yellowed and matted with what looked like old snow or something far worse. His suit, once red, was torn and frayed, now a filthy brown, stained with dark marks that I dared not analyze. But it was his eyes, those piercing, soulless eyes that made me freeze with terror. They weren't the warm, twinkling eyes of Santa you see in Christmas cards or the mall. No, these eyes were dead, empty, black holes that seemed to draw the light into them, suffocating it. The room felt colder now, unnaturally so, as the man, or whatever he was, stood up, towering over me with a grotesque grin on his face. His smile was too wide, too stretched, almost as if his face didn't fit his skull. The air grew heavy with an indescribable stench, like rotting meat and decay. "Ho, ho, ho," he said, his voice not the jolly, booming one from childhood memories, but a low, rasping sound that seemed to vibrate in my bones. "You've been a naughty child this year, haven't you?" I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. My throat was tight, my words choked by fear. His gaze locked onto me, and I felt the weight of it press down on me, suffocating me, as he took a step closer. I wanted to run, to scream, but my legs refused to move. "Naughty, naughty," he repeated, chuckling darkly. "It's never too late to make things right." I could barely comprehend what was happening, the room spinning around me. The fireplace poker slipped from my grasp as he reached into the sack he had carried with him, pulling out something long and thin. It glinted in the dim light, sharp, metallic. My stomach turned. "You've been a very bad girl," he murmured, almost as if savoring each word. "But I can make you better." Without warning, he lunged at me, the blade in his hand slicing through the air. I managed to dodge just in time, the cold steel grazing my arm, sending a searing pain through me. I staggered back, barely keeping my balance as he came after me again, moving unnaturally fast for someone so large. His laughter filled the air, cruel and mocking, as I scrambled to the door, desperate for any escape. I couldn't reach the knob fast enough, and in a single motion he grabbed my arm, pulling me back with an inhuman strength. "Not so fast," he hissed. He dragged me back to the center of the room, his grip tightening as I struggled, my body feeling weaker by the second. I could feel his breath, cold and foul against my skin as he whispered, "You're mine now." His grip tightened until I thought my bones would snap, and with a sudden jerk, he threw me to the ground. I hit hard, pain shooting up my spine as I gasped for air. The last thing I saw before I blacked out was the monstrous figure towering above me, grinning down with that same horrifying smile. When I woke up, it was morning. The house was quiet, eerily so, and the sunlight filtered through the windows, casting soft, warm light across the room. For a moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare, but as I sat up, I noticed something. My body was covered in scratches and bruises, my skin pale and clammy. The smell of something foul still lingered in the air. As I looked around the living room, I saw it. His boots, still caked with mud, standing in the corner of the room, along with the sack he had carried. And as my gaze fell to the fireplace, I saw the dark stains on the carpet and the chimney, where soot had been smeared in a pattern I couldn't understand. I don't know how I escaped. I don't know how I survived, but I'll never forget the darkness in his eyes, the weight of his presence, or the terrifying realization that Santa had come down the chimney for me, and he wasn't there to deliver presents. I always thought the stories were just urban legends, silly little tales parents told their children to keep them in line during the holidays. But that Christmas, I learned how real they were. It started innocently enough, a simple holiday tradition my family had done for years. We had moved to a small town earlier that year, a picturesque place blanketed in snow and strung with Christmas lights, but there was an air of isolation that I hadn't expected. The people were friendly but distant, as though they carried a secret no outsider could ever understand. It was December 24th, and the chill in the air was almost unbearable as I returned home from the local market. My parents had left earlier that day to visit relatives, leaving me alone in the house. I wasn't worried. I was 22, old enough to enjoy a quiet evening with some hot cocoa and a cheesy Christmas movie. But something felt off the moment I stepped through the door. The lights flickered slightly, and the faint smell of something metallic lingered in the air, though I couldn't find a source. Brushing it off as old wiring or my imagination, I settled in for the night, unaware that my life was about to change forever. The first sign came around 8 p.m., a faint knock at the door. It was strange. No one ever visited unannounced in this town, especially not on Christmas Eve. Cautiously, I peered through the peephole, and there he was, a man dressed as Santa Claus. At least that's what he looked like at first. His suit was bright red but smeared with dark stains that didn't look like dirt. His beard was long and gray, matted and unkempt, and his eyes, those eyes, were hollow and milky, as though they saw through me. He wasn't smiling, not at first, but when I didn't open the door immediately, his lips curled into a grin so wide it looked like his face might split in two. "Merry Christmas," he said in a voice that was both deep and raspy, like the sound of gravel scraping against metal. Every instinct told me not to answer, but my curiosity got the better of me. "Can I help you?" I called through the door, my voice trembling. "You've been a very good girl this year," he replied, his grin widening further. "But I see you've been hiding some naughty secrets." My blood ran cold. How could he know anything about me? I tried to laugh it off, but there was a darkness in his tone that rooted me in place. "I think you have the wrong house," I said, trying to sound confident. He didn't leave. Instead, he stepped back, staring directly at the peephole, as if he could see me through it. "I never have the wrong house," he said, his voice a low growl now, "and I always deliver my gifts." With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. Shaking, I locked every door and window in the house, convincing myself it was just some drunk playing a prank. But deep down, I knew better. Hours passed, and just as I was beginning to relax, I heard it. A soft scratching sound, like nails dragging across glass. It was coming from the living room window. My stomach churned as I slowly approached, heart pounding in my chest. Pulling back the curtain, I saw him again, standing in the snow, his grin somehow even wider. He held a burlap sack in one hand, the other pressed against the glass, leaving streaks of something dark and wet. He didn't knock this time, didn't speak, just stood there, staring at me with those dead, unblinking eyes. I backed away, grabbing my phone to call the police, but the line was dead. The power flickered, then went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. I could hear him now, moving around the house, his heavy boots crunching the snow as he tested each window and door. Desperate, I hid in the closet, clutching a baseball bat I had found in the garage earlier. My breathing was loud and ragged, but I couldn't control it. Then came the sound of breaking glass. He was inside. My mind raced as I heard his footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through the house. "You can't hide from me," he sang, his voice almost playful now. "Santa always knows." I pressed my hand over my mouth, trying not to scream, as his footsteps grew louder, closer. Suddenly, they stopped right outside the closet door. I froze, every muscle in my body tense, as the doorknob turned slowly. The door creaked open, and there he was, hunched over to fit into the small space. His grin so close I could smell his rancid breath. "Found you," he whispered, and in that moment, I swung the bat with every ounce of strength I had, connected with his head, but he didn't fall. Instead, he laughed, a guttural, inhuman sound, and grabbed me by the wrist. His touch was ice cold, his grip like iron, and no matter how hard I fought, I couldn't break free. He dragged me through the house, toward the broken window, and I could see the sack now, writhing as though something or someone was inside it. "You've been hiding from the truth," he said as he forced me outside. "But Santa sees everything." He opened the sack, and I screamed as I saw what was inside. Faces, dozens of them, staring back at me, their eyes wide with terror, their mouths frozen in silent screams. They were children, their small bodies twisted and contorted, their skin pale and lifeless. "They were naughty," he said simply, shoving me toward the sack. "And now it's your turn." I don't know how I escaped. The next thing I remember is waking up in the snow, alone, with no sign of him or the sack. The police didn't believe me, of course, and my parents thought I had just been dreaming. But every year since, on Christmas Eve, I hear it again. The soft scratching at my window, the faint sound of his laughter carried on the wind. I know he's still out there, waiting, watching, and I don't know how much longer I can run. It was a cold Christmas Eve, colder than I had ever remembered, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and stays there. The house was silent, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, draping over every corner, every object, every surface. The tree was set up in the corner of the living room, its dim lights flickering as if they too were aware of something lurking in the dark. I should have felt comforted by the festive decorations, the old stockings hung up with care, and the smell of cinnamon that filled the air. But instead, I felt an unshakable dread that clawed at my chest. My parents had gone to bed early, leaving me alone with my thoughts, and strangely, alone with the feeling that I wasn't alone at all. As I sat by the window, staring out into the empty street, I noticed something odd. There, across the street, in the dim light of the street lamps, a figure stood. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the swaying branches of the old oak tree. But as I blinked, the figure remained. A tall figure, hunched over, its head tilted unnaturally to one side, its form draped in tattered red fabric, something that resembled the traditional Santa Claus suit, but more decayed, more wrong. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air. I tried to look away, thinking it was just some drunk person trying to ruin the holiday spirit, but I couldn't. My eyes were locked onto that figure, and for the first time, I realized that it wasn't moving. It wasn't breathing. It was just standing there, staring directly at my window. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself it was just my overactive imagination, but the longer I stared, the more I felt a presence, a sense of something ancient and malevolent that was beyond any holiday cheer. The thing didn't move, it just waited. I decided to distract myself, but the more I tried to turn away, the more I could feel its gaze on me, like a pressure on my very soul. I got up and tried to busy myself with something, anything, hoping that if I ignored it, it would go away. But then there was a noise, a scraping sound, faint at first, but growing louder, closer. It was coming from the chimney. I froze. The wind had died down outside, and the house was eerily still, but the sound kept growing. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It sounded like claws against stone, slow and deliberate. Then, just as I started to panic, the scraping stopped. There was an awful, dead silence. For what felt like hours, nothing moved, nothing stirred. Then I heard it, the softest thud, like something heavy dropping onto the floor. I didn't want to look, but I had to. Slowly, I turned my head toward the fireplace, my heart pounding in my chest. What I saw made me wish I had never turned around. There, in the darkened corner of the room, was a figure. A man. No, not a man, at least not anymore. It was as if something had once been a person, a Santa Claus, but time and decay had twisted it into something far worse. Its eyes were hollow, black voids, and its face was twisted into an unnatural, jagged grin, teeth yellow and sharp like a predator's. The red suit it wore was tattered, the fur around the collar matted with dirt and something darker. Its hands were elongated, fingers too long, too sharp. It grinned at me, and I could hear it. Hear the faintest sound of its breath, a low, guttural wheeze that filled the room. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. I wanted to run, but my legs were paralyzed, my body frozen in terror. The creature, the thing that had once been Santa, took a step forward, and I felt a cold wind rush through the room, carrying with it a faint smell of pine and rot. I could feel its gaze, cold and predatory, as it moved closer. Its hand reached up, and I could see something in it. A sack. The sack that every child thought would hold gifts, presents, but this one was different. The sack wasn't filled with toys. No, it was filled with something far worse. As the creature inched closer, the sack moved, and something inside it stirred. The sound of scratching, the smell of something rotten. The sack opened slowly, and as it did, I saw them. Eyes, dozens of eyes, all staring at me, glistening like pearls in the dim light. The thing had been carrying other children. Their eyes were wide with fear, their faces twisted in agony, mouths silent, their bodies frozen in time as if they had been stuffed into that bag, never to escape. They were alive but not alive. Trapped. The creature grinned wider, its eyes never leaving me as it spoke in a voice that sounded like gravel scraping against metal. "You've been naughty," it rasped, its voice sending shivers through my entire body. "And naughty children don't get gifts. They get something else." I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry, my body refusing to move. The thing reached into the sack and pulled out one of the children. It was a boy, no older than me, his face pale and covered in sweat. He was limp, his body stiff as the creature held him up by the arms, his eyes wide and terror-stricken. "This is what happens when you don't listen," the creature growled. It tossed the boy aside like a broken doll, and he crumpled to the floor in a heap, unmoving. The creature's eyes then turned back to me, took another step, its shadow growing longer, swallowing the light. "You're next," it hissed. I was no longer able to move, my legs too weak, my heart too heavy with dread. I could feel the coldness in the room thickening, as if the very air was choking me, wrapping around my neck like a noose. The thing reached out, its hand coming closer, its long, bony fingers stretching toward me. I could feel the icy chill of its touch even before it made contact. "Merry Christmas," it whispered, its breath hot and foul against my face. Then, before I could even react, everything went dark. I don't know how long I was out. When I awoke, I was alone in the living room, the tree still glowing softly in the corner, the fire still crackling in the hearth. But everything was wrong. The air was still heavy, thick with the remnants of something unholy. The sack was gone. The creature was gone. But I could still feel its presence, lingering in the room like a shadow that refused to leave. I stumbled to my feet, trembling, my heart still racing. That was the last Christmas I would ever spend in that house. I left the next morning, never to return. I don't know what happened to the creature. I don't know if it was real or if it was just a nightmare, but I still hear the faint scratching sometimes, the sound of claws against stone, and I know it's waiting for the next naughty child to cross its path. And I pray to God that I'm never the one it finds again. It started when I was younger, around 10 years old, and it's one of those memories I try to bury every year when the holidays roll around. It was Christmas Eve, and the air outside was thick with snow, the kind of heavy, wet snow that muffled every sound and made the night feel colder than it should have been. My family had just finished setting up the Christmas tree in the living room. There were lights twinkling in every corner of the house, and my parents had promised that they would let me stay up late to open presents after midnight. I remember being so excited that I could hardly sit still, my eyes glued to the clock as I waited for the hour to arrive. But as the night deepened, something started to feel wrong, though I couldn't place what it was. At first, it was subtle, a slight shift in the air, a cold draft creeping through the cracks of the window. The warmth of the house seemed to retreat, as though the cold had somehow crept into the walls. But I brushed it off, telling myself it was just the snow outside making everything feel off. As the night grew later, I began to hear faint sounds coming from the front porch. At first, I assumed it was the wind, maybe a tree branch brushing against the house or the snow settling on the roof. But then the sounds grew more distinct, slow, heavy footsteps crunching in the snow. I looked out the window, but I couldn't see anything. The street was quiet, and the shadows seemed to stretch impossibly long in the moonlight. I figured it was probably just someone walking by, maybe a late-night traveler or a neighbor coming home from a party. But the footsteps didn't stop. They came closer, slow and deliberate, dragging through the snow like a heavy weight. I told myself to ignore it, to get back to waiting for midnight, but the noise persisted. It was as if someone was standing right outside my door, just waiting. After what felt like hours of endless waiting, the sound stopped. The house was eerily quiet, and I thought for a moment that it had all been a figment of my imagination. Maybe I had been hearing things. I turned away from the window and went to the living room to get a drink of water, but when I reached the hallway, I stopped dead in my tracks. The living room door was open. Shouldn't have been. My parents were supposed to be asleep, and I was certain I had locked the door behind me when I left to check the window. But now it was ajar, just a few inches, and the darkness beyond the threshold seemed unnaturally thick, like it was swallowing the light from the hallway. I stood there frozen, my heart pounding, and the temperature in the house seemed to drop. I slowly walked toward the door, my feet dragging across the wooden floor, every step like a drumbeat in the silence. When I pushed the door open, I expected to see the usual glow of the Christmas tree, but there was something different about the room. The lights on the tree flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. And there, standing in front of the tree, was Santa Claus. He wasn't the jolly, red-cheeked figure from the books and the cartoons. This Santa was tall, too tall, and his suit was frayed and stained. His skin was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes were the worst part, black as coal, empty, with no spark of life behind them. He wasn't holding a sack of presents, nor was he laughing as Santa is supposed to do. Instead, he was standing motionless, his head slightly tilted to one side, as if he were waiting for something. I stood there, paralyzed, unable to move, unable to speak. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The air around me seemed thick, heavy, as though the very atmosphere was closing in. And then, without a word, Santa slowly turned his head toward me. His movements were jerky, unnatural, like something that had long since lost the ability to move freely. He reached out a hand, his fingers long and skeletal, and beckoned me closer. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. They felt like lead, rooted to the spot as if I had no control over my own body. And then, in a voice that was a rasping whisper, barely audible above the pounding of my heart. He spoke. "You've been a good boy this year," he said, but his voice was cold, hollow, the words falling from his lips like they belonged to someone else. "And good boys get what they deserve." Before I could even comprehend what he meant, the room seemed to tilt. The shadows around the tree stretched unnaturally long, and I felt a presence move behind me, brushing against my skin like ice. I turned to look, but when I did, I saw nothing but a thick black void. I could hear faint whispers, low and distorted, just behind my ears, but I couldn't make out the words. My head was spinning, and I stumbled backward, my vision blurring. Santa took another step forward, his boots scraping against the floor with a sound that sent shivers down my spine. The closer he got, the more I felt like I was suffocating. The air was thick, oppressive, and my chest tightened. I finally managed to turn and run, but it wasn't enough. As soon as I made it to the front door, I tried to open it, only to find it locked. I pulled at the handle, panicked, my breath coming in short gasps, but the door wouldn't budge. Behind me, I heard the soft shuffle of footsteps, closer now, and then, just as I thought I had no way out, I felt a hand on my shoulder. Cold, ice cold, and impossibly heavy. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the darkness. And in that darkness, I heard the laughter, low, haunting, and then the soft whisper that chilled me to the bone. "It's too late now." The Christmas tree lights flickered one last time, and then went out. The silence that followed was unbearable, suffocating. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Everything around me felt wrong. The shadows stretched and twisted, reaching for me like arms, and I knew, deep down, that I was no longer alone. Santa was still there, watching, waiting, and there was no escape. And now, every Christmas, when the snow falls and the cold seeps in, I hear the footsteps again. I hear them getting closer, and no matter how much I try to run, I know that Santa is still coming for me. It was the middle of December, and the snow outside had begun to fall heavier than usual, blanketing everything in a thick layer of white. The kind of snow that muffled every sound, leaving an eerie silence hanging over the neighborhood. I sat by the window, staring out into the falling flakes, feeling the chill creep through the glass as though the cold itself were trying to find a way inside. Christmas had never been a holiday I particularly cared for, but that year, something felt different. Something felt off. My family had always been traditional, decorating the house with lights, setting up the tree, and hanging stockings on the mantle. It was the same every year, but this time it didn't bring the same comfort. My parents had gone out for a while to visit relatives, leaving me home alone for the evening. I didn't mind, usually I enjoyed the quiet, but tonight the house felt strange. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond my sight. After setting up my usual Christmas decorations in the living room, I noticed something strange on the mantle. A new stocking had appeared. It was large, far larger than the ones my parents and I had hung up. The fabric was an unnatural shade of red, dark and faded as if it had been used for years, and it hung crookedly, the edges frayed and torn. I didn't remember seeing it there earlier. I wasn't sure how it had appeared, but I wasn't exactly feeling brave enough to ask. I thought it was some kind of sick joke, maybe something my parents had arranged, but the longer I looked at it, the more unsettled I became. The stocking was empty, yet I felt its emptiness pressing against me, like it was waiting for something, waiting for me to fill it. My skin prickled as I turned away, trying to push the thought from my mind, but something nagged at me, something dark and sinister, an ominous force in the air that made my pulse race. The clock on the wall struck midnight. The house seemed to groan as the wind howled outside, rattling the windows. And then I heard it, a creaking sound from the hallway, slow and deliberate, like the weight of something heavy moving through the house. I froze. I had been alone for hours, and the house had been silent except for the storm outside. I couldn't explain the noise, but I knew I wasn't imagining it. My heart thudded in my chest as I slowly rose from the couch and crept toward the hallway. The floorboards groaned under my weight, each step sending a ripple of dread through my body. I reached the edge of the hallway and froze. The living room door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, I saw him, Santa Claus, but not the jolly old man you see on Christmas cards. Not the one who hands out presents with a booming laugh. This was a different Santa, an unsettling one. His suit was torn and filthy, his face pale as bone, his beard matted with what looked like dirt and blood. His eyes, black as coal, shone in the dark, reflecting nothing but emptiness. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring at the empty stocking, his hands trembling slightly, his breath ragged. My blood ran cold as the realization hit me. He wasn't just standing there. He was waiting for something, waiting for me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs refused to move. My throat constricted, the air thick with dread. The room seemed to close in on me, the walls pressing tighter as the darkness deepened. The Santa figure's eyes never left the stocking. A low, guttural whisper filled the air. Words I couldn't understand but felt in the pit of my stomach. Then the stocking jerked. It moved, slowly, unnaturally, as if something inside it was struggling to break free. I stumbled backward, my mind spinning. The stocking, large and grotesque, writhed in place as if it had a life of its own. Twitched, bulged, and then slowly, painfully, it began to elongate. A dark, twisted arm emerged from the stocking, fingers like claws scraping against the fabric as they reached out. I felt my stomach churn as I watched the thing crawl its way out. A grotesque creature with pale, twisted limbs and hollow eyes, its body covered in sores and matted hair. It looked at me, and for a moment, I thought I saw recognition in its eyes, but it was too horrifying, too much like something that shouldn't exist. The Santa figure didn't flinch. He just watched as the thing dragged itself from the stocking and onto the floor with an unnatural grace. My legs finally gave way, and I fell to the ground, unable to look away as the creature crawled toward me, its hollow gaze never leaving me. The Santa figure stepped forward, slowly, as though his movements were rehearsed, like he had done this 1,000 times before. He didn't smile, didn't speak. He simply extended his hand toward the creature. It stopped, its head snapping toward the outstretched hand as if it understood. Then, the creature crawled back to the stocking, its eyes still locked onto me, and slowly, it climbed inside, disappearing into the darkness. The stocking stopped moving. Silence fell once more, and I lay there, trembling, too afraid to move. My breath came in shallow gasps as I watched the Santa figure approach the fireplace, his heavy steps echoing in the silence. He stopped in front of the mantel, and for a moment, I thought it was over. But then he turned to face me. His lips parted, and the sound that came from his throat was not a laugh, but a deep, guttural growl. "You were a good child," he rasped. "A very good child." And then, as if on cue, the room seemed to grow colder, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. I was trapped in a room with a creature that was far worse than any nightmare. A Santa who wasn't here to deliver gifts, but to take something far more precious. The last thing I remember was his breath, hot and foul, brushing against my ear as he whispered, "It's time for your gift." Then, darkness. I don't know what happened after that. The next morning, the house was quiet. The snow had stopped falling, but the stockings were gone. The tree was bare, and the air was thick with a sense of unease. I didn't feel safe, not in my own home. But the worst part? When I looked in the mirror, I saw the faintest mark on my cheek, a red, jagged scar. And then, as I stared at it, I could have sworn I heard something, a whisper in the dark, promising that this was just the beginning. And every Christmas since, I feel it, that presence, that thing, waiting, watching, just outside my door.